decision because we respect the independence of our judicial processes.
Difficult but critical. Mediators in the Yemen peace talks say there's a long way to go. Paris braces for another round of protests by the Yellow Vest movement. Thousands of police and armoured vehicles are put on standby. Hello, good to have you with us. There have been sharp falls in global stock markets. They were reacting to doubts about an easing of the trade war between the United States and China. The concerns were aggravated by the news of the arrest of a top executive from the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei. Meng Wanzhou is the chief financial officer and the founder's daughter. She was detained at Vancouver Airport on Saturday on an extradition request from the US. Our China correspondent Stephen McDonald has more.
Chinese tech giant Huawei is today at the forefront of global trade tensions, and the drama will play out in Canada in the coming hours when a senior executive appears in court. Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Vancouver while in transit and reportedly faces extradition to the United States following alleged breaches of Washington's sanctions against sales of technical equipment to Iran. If this is the reason for her to be taken into custody, the Chinese government says it's still been given no explanation for it from either Canada or the United States, claiming such detention without a reason is a human rights violation.
I can't discuss the details of this case here, but what I can tell you is that after learning about it, we've made solemn representations to Canada and the US. We've demanded that both parties immediately clarify the reasons for this detention and that they immediately release the detainee to protect that person's legal rights.
The company has also issued an open letter to its suppliers and partners, saying it too has received very little information regarding her detention, adding that it strictly abides by all international laws. But according to Canada's Prime Minister, this is all a routine extradition procedure.
I can assure everyone that we are a country of an independent judiciary, and the appropriate authorities took the decisions in this case without any political involvement or interference, as must be the case. However, this is a case, obviously, before the courts, upon which there is a publication ban, and it would be inappropriate for me to comment further.
However, the timing of this US request to have a senior Chinese executive arrested seems extraordinary, coming as it does at the beginning of a 90-day truce in the escalation of the trade war. Stephen McDonald, BBC News, Beijing.
Well, earlier I spoke to Marika Oi in our Singapore bureau, and I asked her if a letter released by Huawei to its global supply partners was going to reassure customers.
That's the line that they have been saying since her arrest was reported yesterday. Of course, she was arrested on Saturday when, of course, Presidents Xi and Trump met, agreeing to a trade truce. But that was when she was arrested. We only found out about it yesterday, and when we reached out to Huawei yesterday, they said the same thing, that they have no knowledge of her doing any wrongdoing. And that's exactly what the company said to its corporate partners as well in its letter. But, of course, there are some concerns because Huawei has been under scrutiny in the US. The authorities there have been reportedly investigating the company for some 2 years, and of course it has been blocked in Australia and New Zealand just a few days ago. In the UK as well, BT has said that it will not use any Huawei equipment in its new 5G networks as well as the existing 3G and 4G systems. Now there's a report that the Japanese government might stop buying any of the Huawei and ZTE, another Chinese tech giant, equipment. So there are some things that Chinese companies are concerned about, and if you look at the reaction, especially on social media in China, a lot of outrage that this is just yet another way of the Western governments trying to stop Huawei and of course ZTE, which was fined last year in the United States, from doing well overseas.
So a lot of anger there in China over the arrest. What can China actually do to retaliate?
Well, I think at this moment they don't have enough information of why she's arrested and what's going to happen. Her bail hearing has been set for later today in Canada, so we'll see what happens there. And of course, if the US officially requests her extradition and what happens there. But of course, we have heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. We also had a very strongly worded statement from the Chinese embassy in Canada, strongly protesting the arrest, immediately demanding her release. So definitely Beijing is not happy about the arrest.
Marika Oy in Singapore for us there. Now, the rising trade tensions between the US and China are just one area where President Trump's promises are now being judged against reality. Last week, General Motors announced that it plans to stop production at 5 factories and cut more than 14,000 jobs. Among the plants scheduled to close is Lordstown in Ohio, and Lee McBull's been there to see the impact.
This single factory covers an astonishing 900 acres. But after more than 50 years producing cars at this site, General Motors, once America's biggest employer, has announced that from the spring, no more vehicles are due to be made here. Casey King has worked at the plant her entire adult life.
It's almost like you're experiencing a death. You know, it's just hard to imagine that the one thing you thought you would never hear and never wanted to hear just happened.
With some job losses in recent years, Casey and many others had considered selling their homes and moving elsewhere.
Let me tell you folks in Ohio...
Last year, though, visiting here, the president promised this.
Don't sell your house. Do not sell it. We're going to get those values up. We're going to get those jobs coming back. And
he made so many promises to so many people, and I've heard people compare him to a snake oil salesman, where he's just, you know, going around and selling false hope.
But General Motors says it's just restructuring, and that's not Donald Trump's fault. In another industry here, though, it's a different story. Well, here on the other side of Ohio, we're very much in farming territory, and agriculture has been devastated as a direct result of decisions made by the White House and the exports to China that have plummeted. Alan Armstrong's family's been growing soybeans in Ohio for generations, but Donald Trump's economic sparring with China has made for the most difficult of years.
You know, 60% of all the soybeans we raised have been exported over the last 5 years to China. And when the trade dispute / trade war started, effectively those sales went to zero.
But in recent days on social media, the president's been making more promises that China will start buying US agricultural products again, including soybeans. And in spite of facing so many problems because of the trade war, Alan, who voted for Donald Trump, is sticking by him.
I don't remember in my lifetime a president of the United States talking about agriculture as often as I've heard Donald Trump speak about ag. Okay?
So you don't hear people saying in the community, you know, I voted for the guy, now look what's happened, I regret that.
Yeah, no. You don't hear that. You hear, gosh, I hope he knows what he's doing.
And though he hasn't been able to deliver on his promises elsewhere, they still retain their faith in the president. Aleem Maqbool, BBC News in Ohio.
Well, President Donald Trump has reportedly chosen Senate Department spokesperson Heather Nauert as the new ambassador to the United Nations. Ms. Nauert is a former Fox News Channel anchor and became the State Department spokesperson in April last year. She'll replace the outgoing ambassador Nikki Haley, who announced her resignation in October. Ms. Haley held the position for 18 months. In France, the Eiffel Tower and a number of museums and markets in Paris will be shut on Saturday. That's because of fears of more street violence involving the Yellow Vest protest movement. The demonstrators were initially about fuel tax rises, but they've since broadened and include anger over living costs as well as anger with President Macron himself. Close to 90,000 people, police are expected to be deployed across the country, as well as armoured vehicles in the capital. Georgina Smythe has this report.
France on yellow alert. Burnt-out cars, violence and vandalism scenes not to be repeated this weekend, according to the French Prime Minister. Addressing the Senate and announcing almost 90,000 boots on the ground, Edouard Philippe called for calm while reminding protesters of Parliament's decision to drop the fuel tax rises that ignited the protests in the first place. But some demonstrators were not impressed.
The only person who has the power is the President. So the President has to stand in front of the people of France as the father of the nation. That's his role, to be the keystone. But he has to speak to the French people from the gut and with his heart.
Discontent has only grown around the country since the protests began in mid-November. Anger now extends to high living costs, marginalisation felt in rural areas, and grievances felt by ambulance drivers, pensioners and students. This group of protesters in western France, blocking access to a refinery, have set up camp for the long term.
The decision made yesterday is pointless. It's just hot air. It's what we call magic dust in these parts. It's just meant to hypnotise the people. But people aren't naive, and people are still angry.
A list of more than 40 demands have been issued to the government, and some of Paris's most iconic sites will be closed on Saturday amid fears of further street violence. Georgina Smythe, BBC News.
Do stay with us on BBC News, still to come. Alone in the Southern Ocean, dismasted and drifting, a long-distance rescue is underway for the round-the-world yachtswoman.
John Lennon was shot at the entrance to the Dakota building in the center of New York. There's been a crowd here standing in more or less silent vigil, and the flowers have been piling up.
The 14th ceasefire of this war ended at the walls of the old city of Dubrovnik. This morning, witnesses said shells were landing every 20 seconds.
People are celebrating the passing of a man they hold responsible for hundreds of deaths and oppression. Elsewhere, people have been gathering to mourn his passing.
Imelda Marcos, the widow of the president of the Philippines, has gone on trial in Manila. She's facing 7 charges of tax evasion. She pleaded not guilty.
The Prince and Princess of Wales are to separate. A statement from Buckingham Palace said the decision had been reached amicably.
This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. Asian stock markets have recovered slightly despite fears that the US-China trade war will resume after the arrest of a senior executive of Huawei. Canada has defended its decision to arrest that Huawei top executive on a US extradition request. The Canadian Prime Minister said it was a legal, not political decision. Peace talks aimed at ending the civil war in Yemen have been described by the UN Special Envoy as an important milestone. Thousands of people have died in nearly 4 years of fighting in the country, with millions pushed to the brink of starvation. Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette reports from Stockholm, where those talks are taking place.
Yemen is on its last breath. Its children dying every day from hunger and disease and a devastating war. Tens of thousands of young lives have ended since this war escalated in 2015. Today, a faint glimmer of hope. Around a table in faraway Sweden, Houthi rebels and the government sitting together for the first time in more than 2 years. The UN got them here to talk.
Let us be in no doubt that Yemen's future is in the hands of those of us in this room, and we must act now before we lose control of the future of Yemen. Let none of us waver in spite of the challenges that we may face.
But on Yemen's killing fields, there are other powerful players and arch-enemies like Saudi Arabia and Iran. They all call for peace, but continue the war. In the old city of the capital, Sana'a, Yemenis know how hard this will be. We hope the talks in Sweden succeed, this trader says, but there's little hope in our situation. Both sides will have to compromise. It would be a nice surprise for everyone, says this woman, but logically, I don't think our situation will improve. If all goes to plan, the lights in this Swedish castle will burn long into the night for the next week. The goal? To come up with a roadmap for peace. That's ambitious, given that the two sides are so far apart. But with Yemen on the brink of collapse, every step counts, which brings them closer. Lise Doucette, BBC News, outside Stockholm.
The international medical charity Médecins Sans Frontières say that the ship, the Aquarius, will no longer be carrying out life-saving rescue operations in the Mediterranean. MSF said that it had to take this step after what it described as a sustained campaign by the Italian government and other European countries to smear and obstruct aid organisations trying to save the lives of vulnerable people at sea. Sophie Long has more.
More life jackets, take them off, people, if you must. Let's go!
The number of people attempting to cross the Mediterranean has fallen, but the journey remains as dangerous as ever. Médecins Sans Frontières says with its partner organisation SOS Méditerranée, it's rescued or helped more than 80,000 people over the past 4 years. But in recent months, as men, women and children continue to embark on the world's deadliest migration route, the charity's search and rescue vessel, the Aquarius, has remained in port. Its licence revoked and its crew accused of criminal activity. Accusations the aid organisation categorically denies. MSF is bitterly critical of European governments. It says they've failed to provide enough dedicated rescue capacity of their own, then actively sabotaged the efforts of others trying to save lives in the Mediterranean. It says European countries have violated international law by refusing to allow those rescued at sea access to safe ports and have instead enabled the forced return of thousands of them to detention camps in Libya. It says EU governments have created a climate that discourages ships at sea from carrying out their obligations to rescue people in distress, and that now it's been forced to terminate its own vital search and rescue work. It will result in more avoidable deaths that will go unwitnessed and unrecorded. Sophie Long, BBC News.
Cuba has the lowest internet connectivity rate in the Western Hemisphere. Now, though, people there will be able to get 3G internet access on their mobile phones instead of having to use Wi-Fi hotspots and internet cafes. Broadband has been available to state-approved clients for quite some time now. Analysts say the new service may be too costly, though, for many people. From Cuba, here's Will Grant.
It is a day many Cubans had thought might never come. Finally, after years of waiting, they can get the internet on their phones. While that might sound underwhelming in countries where such a luxury is considered normal, Cuba remains one of the most offline nations in the world. The new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, appears determined to change that. Under the new plan, Cubans can get packages of 3G data on their phones for prices ranging from $7 to $30 a month, depending on usage. The prices are high for those on state wages, but some may consider it a sacrifice worth making, especially if they can stop having to rely on public access Wi-Fi squares to read their emails or speak to their families abroad.
It's a great opportunity which is going to resolve the problems people have to speak to their families and their loved ones abroad.
Everyone is going to be connected to everyone else internationally. They'll see our news in the rest of the world and on social media, which are now the most important.
It will be good to have more contact with our families. It will make studying easier. For looking up things on Google, for social networks, for playing games, it will bring many good things.
Some, though, remain unconvinced, especially by the prices.
I can't see the logic of paying up to $30 for the package when you can come here to the park and connect to the Wi-Fi spot.
The irony is that, having waited so long, Cuba could theoretically jump past fibre optics and have all its internet access in the cloud.
That's, for me, the smartest step to take. You know, besides, ADSL, for example, is really tricky, really complicated. It goes down all the time. You have to live at some specific distance from the central, and you know, it's super expensive to do. It's just too expensive, and it's unrealistic.
While some countries are contemplating 5G, the arrival of 3G on their mobile phones does at least bring Cubans a step closer to the rest of the world. Many people see it as a positive sign that the government is finally serious about bringing Cuba properly online. Still, in infrastructure alone, there is a long way to go before the island can be considered truly connected. Will Grant, BBC News, Havana.
A search and rescue operation is underway to find a 29-year-old British sailor whose boat was wrecked as she took part in a solo race around the world. Susie Goodall is the youngest competitor and the only woman taking part in the 30,000-mile Golden Globe race. Her yacht was badly damaged and lost its mast in a storm in the Southern Sea, around 2,000 miles west of the southern tip of South America. Since then, she's been in radio contact, but her location is so remote that the nearest boat isn't expected to reach her until later on Friday. John Kay has more.
The boat is destroyed. Inside and out is destroyed.
This is the call Susie Goodall made after her boat flipped over. In the southern Pacific Ocean, alone, injured, and thousands of miles from dry land.
We rolled and I threw across the cabin, and I think I was knocked out for a moment or two.
The 29-year-old set sail in July and was coming fourth in one of the world's most grueling events when she hit a ferocious storm.
In school it was, what do you want to do when you grow up kind of thing. My thing was always like, I want to sail around the world.
Speaking before the race, she knew the Southern Ocean would be the toughest part of her round-the-world challenge.
I'm sure there'll be times down there I just think, what the hell am I doing? This is horrendous. The boat is just like a rag doll. It's been chucked around all over the place and you can do nothing about it.
The first man to complete the Golden Globe race knows Susie well and says waiting for help will be exhausting.
I think she'll be a little bit debilitated by, you know, the adrenaline she's lost with everything going on. In fact, she hasn't a good night's sleep. But Susie Goodall's very experienced and she's tough.
This Chinese cargo ship is the closest vessel to Susie. It's been diverted hundreds of miles through challenging seas to rescue her. On social media, she said all she wants is a nice cup of tea. John Kay, BBC News.
Well, Don McIntyre is the founder and race chairman of the Golden Globe race, and he's been telling the BBC more about that rescue mission.
It's being coordinated by the Chile Rescue Coordination Centre. It's their zone of responsibility. They've found a ship about 400 miles away. It's currently steaming to the area, but it's in heavy weather, so it's slowed down to about 6 knots, and it's a bit later than expected, but it'll all start to happen tonight around about 9 o'clock, and it's still very challenging. We're unsure whether they'll be able to launch a small boat to go over and recover her and come back and bring it on board again because of the sea state. If that's not possible, the captain's going to have to manoeuvre a 190-metre vessel, which is about 45,000 tonnes, as close as he can to the yacht, and Susie will literally have to jump maybe onto a cargo net or a ladder. We're not sure yet. The final planning's yet to be made. Right now she's doing it tough, but she's an incredibly strong and competent sailor, so she understands the reality of her situation, and it's a tough challenge. She's already sailed 2/3 of the way around the world and been doing extremely well, and her boat was built by one of the best builders in the world, and the mast and rigging by one of the biggest mast builders in the world, and she got caught in a particularly bad storm, and she actually rolled over, but also went upside down in terms of the stern went over the bow of the boat. She was concussed when she was thrown around inside, woke up, she wasn't sure how long she was out of it. She's badly bruised, but she's okay. Her hands are cut up when she had to cut the rigging off and get it over the side of the boat before it put a hole in the boat. She feels as if she's let some people down. She's got a huge following, but she is very strong, and You know, I mean, Susie's a great sailor, but she's even a bit seasick right now because of the motion of the boat without the mast and the whole concept. But she is focused now. She knows what's ahead of her. She knows it's a whole new challenge to get off the boat and try and get back to the UK and loved ones.
Don McIntyre there, the founder of the Golden Globe race. The lead singer of the punk rock band Buzzcocks, Pete Shelley, has died suddenly at the age of 63. It's thought he suffered a heart attack in Estonia, where he was living. The band, who formed in the 1970s, are best known for their hit Ever Fall in Love. The hit BBC comedy music show Nevermind the Buzzcocks was named after them. Pete Shelley, who has died today at the age of 63. That's all from us for now. Thank you for watching.
Hello there. We're ending the week on a pretty turbulent note. Some strong winds on the way to Scotland. Severe gales here could cause some problems. And as well as the very strong winds on Friday in Scotland, we'll also have some heavy rain around, particularly across southwest England over the next few hours, and that could bring some localised surface water flooding. The troublemaker is this developing area of low pressure. Pressure continues to fall and the low pressure deepens, and that continues to strengthen the winds. Now, the strongest winds will be going into the north of the UK, but you can see some of the heaviest rain will be trailing back across Wales into southwest England. Here, 40 millimetres of rain, and that could cause a few issues first thing Friday morning. Certainly some big puddles on your morning commute across this part of the world. The winds will continue to strengthen as we go on through the next few hours, and there is a good chance, if you're going outside in the next couple of hours, of seeing some pretty heavy rain around as well. But it won't be a cold start to the day. The winds, though, will continue to strengthen through the morning across Northern Ireland and then into Scotland. This is where the strongest winds are going to come through. Probably the strongest winds around midday, early afternoon, with gusts of wind of around 70 to 80 miles an hour. Could even top that in one or two of the very, very most exposed locations. There'll be heavy rain as well. Further south, our band of rain will continue to push eastwards across England, clearing Friday, and we'll see some sunshine following and a few showers for western parts of England and Wales to end the day. Showers too for Northern Ireland. Temperatures will be falling through the afternoon, 7 to 10 degrees as that cooler air continues to work its way in. Now, as far as the weekend goes, it will stay pretty windy and blustery, and we're looking at further showers around, particularly on Saturday. It turns cooler on Sunday, but with a bit more in the way of sunshine. Here's a chance then to take us through Friday night. Those strong winds still buffeting Scotland. It will take a while for those winds to ease down, and then we'll start to see the next system approaching from the west. So this is the forecast for Saturday. Most of us will see at least some bright or sunny spells, but it's going to be a blustery kind of day, with rain or showers moving in from the west and pushing eastwards as the day goes by. So it's one of those days where most of us will see at least a spell of rain. Temperatures between 9 and 13 degrees Celsius, so we're just about on the mild side of things. However, for the second half of the weekend, as the winds switch around more to a northwesterly, still with some showers knocking around, well, it's going to start to feel a little bit cooler than that. Those showers are really quite likely to work in to North Wales and parts of northwest England, particularly around Cheshire, Greater Manchester and Merseyside, and the temperatures going down 7 to 11 degrees your high on Sunday.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The Papers, weeknights at 10:40 on the BBC News Channel.
Sometimes being in the driving seat is... She stayed in school. She's a... This isn't just playing sports. This is... The simple act of standing, and you're a... You don't need superpowers to change the world. 100 Women. A season of inspiring and challenging stories across the BBC.
This is BBC News, the headlines. Asian stock markets have stabilised after Thursday's dramatic falls in Europe and the United States. Concerns are growing about a resumption of the trade war between the US and China. Canada has defended the arrest of a top executive from the Chinese technology firm Huawei on a US extradition request. Prime Minister Trudeau says it was not political. China's demanded her release. And at the start of the first Yemen peace talks in 2 years, the UN envoy for the country has called the meeting a critical opportunity to give momentum to peace. The government and the Houthi rebels have agreed to a limited prisoner exchange. Those are your headlines on BBC News. Now on BBC News, Stephen Sacco is in Washington with Hard Talk.
Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacco. How do we decide what is important? How do we balance the personal priorities of the here and now with the big picture challenges that will determine the future of human civilization? Well, my guest today is used to considering the biggest of canvases. Martin Rees is one of the world's leading astrophysicists, but recently he's been gazing into the future of our own planet. The next century, he says, will determine humanity's long-term destiny. So, are the prospects good or grim? Martin Rees, welcome to Hard Talk.
Good to be here.
We are used to you training your gaze to the furthest most corners of the universe, and yet here you are, having just published a book on the prospects for humanity. So now your focus is here on the blue planet, on Earth, and you appear to believe that this century we are living in is the most critical humankind has ever known. Why?
Well, because the Earth's been around for 45 million centuries, but this is the first when one species, namely the human species, has the power to affect what happens next. And this is for two reasons. First, there are more of us, 7.7 billion, number growing, and we are more empowered by technology, and we are already affecting the Earth biosphere, the climate, and biodiversity, etc. And secondly, we are empowered by technology, which means that even a few people have the power to disrupt society completely. So that makes society fragile. So this is the first century when we've had these new threats, those we cause collectively and those we are able to cause even in small groups. And this is the first time this has ever happened.
And if you are to give the threats a sort of weight and a scale, what are the threats that you see out there today which we could call existential, which in your view actually threaten the survival of human civilization as we know it today?
Yes, I think in any case we have a bumpy ride through the century. Just how bumpy does depend on choices that we make politically. But I think there are two things we can predict 30 to 50 years ahead. One is the population will be larger. We have to cope with more than 9 billion people. And secondly, the climate will be warmer. We have to cope with that. So I think if you ask about the timescales, on the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to be worried, in my view, more about bio and cyber and the misuse of those technologies. But if we look 50 or 100 years ahead, then we are going to have to worry about these global trends. And I think one of the issues I raise in my book very strongly is, to what extent do we make sacrifices now in order to remove risks from people at the end of a century? Normally, if you're a builder putting up a building, you'd want your money back by 20. You'd apply a 5% per year discount rate or something, and you wouldn't care about what happens beyond 2050. Some people who address the climate issue, like Born Lomborg, who's a sort of bogeyman among environmentalists. He takes this view and downplays the importance of climate change compared to more immediate ways of helping the world's poor. But that's because he writes off beyond 2050, whereas many of us feel that in the context of human lives we ought to apply a smaller discount rate and be prepared to think now about what risks might be confronted by babies born today who will still be alive in the 22nd century.
So your contention is that human beings, whether they be simple citizens like me or or you, or political leaders who actually wield real power, we should, all of us, be thinking in and planning and strategizing in timeframes that go far beyond even the 5-decade span.
Well, in some contexts we do. Obviously, in some contexts we can't plan even 10 or 20 years ahead. I mean, the ubiquity of smartphones, for instance, would have seemed magic just 20 years ago. So some technologies we can't predict that far ahead, but when we can plausibly predict 50 or 100 years ahead, as we can in the case of population, biodiversity and climate, then I think we should take account of that.
Thing is, if I may interrupt, you've been at this for a while. You know, you've been concerned about the prospects of humanity for several years. In fact, I'm mindful that in 2003 you wrote a book, Our Final Hour, in which you gave, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you gave civilization a 50-50 chance of surviving the 21st century. It doesn't seem to me that in the, what is it, the 15 years since then, there's any reason to believe the odds have got better. In fact, surely they've gotten worse.
I think they're about the same, but we can be slightly more specific about ordering what risks are serious and what can be dismissed.
So when we get down to what's to be done, do you agree with Sir David Attenborough, for example, who at the UN climate talk meeting, a big international conference in Poland just the other day, said, we are facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in 1,000 years, it is climate change, and if we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. Do you agree with him and therefore feel that climate change has to be the dominant issue for all of us, leaders and citizens?
I wouldn't be quite so apocalyptic as him, but it clearly is an important threat to address, and it's especially difficult because we are asking people now to pay regard to what will happen 50 or 100 years ahead in remote parts of the world. And that's clearly a hard sell to politicians. And the reason that people like Attenborough are important is that politicians will listen if there is strong public support. And of course it's people like David Attenborough who can help that. If I can give another example, I was a bit involved in a scientific conference that led to the drafting of the papal encyclical in 2015, which was before the 2015 Paris climate
before the
change.
Paris Accords were signed,
And it had a big effect. The Pope got a standing ovation at the UN, and whatever you think about the Church, you can't deny its long-term vision, its concern for the world poor and its global range. And I think if we are to address these issues at all, then it's got to be because the politicians are aware that there's public support for them. And public support comes from people like David Attenborough and the Pope.
The thing is that there is an idealism to your view of what humanity must do. You talk repeatedly about the need for rationality, for collective action, for an international approach to this. And of course climate change is perhaps the most obvious example where only collective international action can truly be said to be effective. But it's not happening, is it? And in fact, if one looks around the world, the impulse in many parts of the world is away from the collective action to much more nationalistic policy strategies.
And indeed, there's grounds for pessimism, and indeed I would counter the optimists like Steven Pinker who say things are getting better by pointing out that though in many ways they are, in the present era the gap between the way things are and the way they could be is wider than ever, because we do have the technology to provide a better world for the 7.5 billion people around now and to address all these issues in ways which I comment on in my book, but we're not doing it. So the gap between what we could do and what we are doing is depressingly wide, and this is an ethical indictment of our age in a sense.
Well, interesting phrase, ethical indictment. Do you see it as your role today to be less the scientist, still, as you have been so much of your life, fascinated by seeking explanation of the origins of the universe, black holes, dark matter, all of that stuff we know you for, do you find yourself more and more inclined to focus on an effort to persuade all of us, but in particular our political leaders, that they have to take seriously the messages from science about the future of the planet?
Well, I'm a scientist, I'm also a citizen and also a university teacher, and in those contexts surely one ought to make people aware of these. I'm not a great public figure, but I think it's very important to ensure that the public is informed and our students are informed.
But how do you, I mean, let's be practical. You're not a citizen of the United States, but nonetheless, I'm sure you watch, as like the rest of us, what happens in the most economically powerful nation on earth. When President Trump gets to see the latest analysis from his own federally funded scientists about the dramatic impacts that climate change will have on the United States over the next decades. And he says, quite frankly and openly, I don't believe it. What is your conclusion?
Well, that's deeply depressing, but it reinforces what I said earlier, which is the only way to get to politicians is via the public. They won't listen directly to experts. They will listen, though, if there's a strong public feeling. And if we think of great changes in the United States, slavery and its abolition, black power, gay rights, they all started with public movements, and only when the public was clearly on side did the politicians respond. And that's why I think in these issues it's important to engage with the wide public.
But it's no easier, is it, to connect with the public than it is with leaders like Donald Trump, or one could say Vladimir Putin, or one could say the new president of Brazil, all of whom seem to believe that policy making is some sort of zero-sum game, where if their nation doesn't win, then their nation automatically loses, which is a mindset absolutely antithetical to your message about the future of the planet.
Indeed, it's depressing, but in this country where things aren't that bad, the politicians are on the whole positive, but of course unless they know they have public support, then they won't prioritise these issues. In fact, as Jean-Paul Juncker said in a different context, we know what to do, we don't know how to get re-elected when we've done it. And that's the view of many politicians, and they will only be responsive if they feel that they won't lose public support. And so that's why I think it's important to influence public opinion.
So education, and you are, after all, if nothing else, an educationalist.
That's right.
You must regard tapping into the mind, the collective mind of the public, as the most important role you have.
Well, of course, and in the context of students, who are the ones I have most contact with, to ensure that they are aware of these issues that will come up in their lifetime. And I should mention, I'm gratified by the number of students who do have these long-term concerns.
Science should show humility, though, shouldn't it? Because many of the problems that you've just alluded to, whether it be the climate change issue, of course, based on carbon emissions and everything that's come with industrialization, or on a different sort of frame, but equally dangerous in your view, weapons of mass destruction, whether they be nuclear or biological or indeed cyber terror of the future. All of these things are the product of science, people like you.
Of course they are, yes, but scientists, of course, should be aware of the uses to which their work could be put, and they normally don't know this because, for instance, the inventor of the laser had no idea that his invention would be used not only as a weapon but for eye surgery and for DVDs. You had no idea, and that's true of all inventions. They have a benign consequence in others. I think these scientists have to make sure that the politicians and the public are aware, but also all the decisions on how to use science involve ethics, economics and politics. And scientists, of course, are just citizens in those respects. They're not experts. So scientists can offer advice when expertise, but of course they have a role as citizens as well. And of course I mentioned in my book the great men who were involved in making the first atomic bomb, Joe Rotblat and Hans Bethe, people like that, and they returned to civilian life, but they felt they had an obligation to do what they could to harness the powers they'd helped unleash. They didn't succeed, but they felt they had a special responsibility. And I think scientists do, but they can't expect that their word will be the one that holds sway.
Indeed, they cannot, and they cannot know where some of their inventions, as you've just put it, will take humanity. But I just wonder, and it strikes me that, you know, you're now looking back over the course of a very long career and friendships with Stephen Hawking and many other things. I'm just wondering whether you feel now that actually what matters most isn't the expansion of human knowledge, the stuff you've been working at all of your life, but understanding human nature. It is ultimately human nature that will dictate whether we as a species continue to thrive or whether we self-destruct.
Well, 2 points. There's no conflict between those things. Indeed, there's a positive correlation between those who think about one and the other. But also, thinking about science, I think if we look back, despite all the downsides, it's clear that we couldn't have 7.7 billion people at least being fed in this world without the technology that had come in the last 50 years. So I think we don't really want to stop science. We just need to ensure that we can avoid its downsides.
But I'll tell you what I'm fascinated by, not least in the book. It's when you start looking forward. Yes, we're in a bit of a pickle, and you've got some prescriptions for how we can avoid the worst of the pickle. But then you start thinking very creatively about where intelligence may be going next, and you're suggesting that it may go beyond this sort of organic human intelligence that we have and that we've made the most of to a certain extent in the last 1,000 years. You're suggesting there may very soon be a crossover point where we marry our human intelligence with inorganic electronic intelligence. I just want you to explain what you mean.
Well, first, why I'm interested in this, astronomers are perhaps more aware than most people of the far future. Most educated people know where the outcome of 4 billion years of Darwinian selection, but they tend to think we humans are their culmination. But no astronomer can believe that. We know the Earth's less than halfway through its life, and we may not be even the halfway stage in evolution. But then, going back to us being in a special century, one of the things that may change this century is that electronic intelligence may in many respects become comparable with human intelligence of an organic kind in our brains. And this is a real game changer, because this may mean that future evolution is not Darwinian, but it's sort of a kind of secular intelligent design when we redesign species. And this is scary in a way, and this is an ethical question, of course. Which already people talk about genetic modification, etc., and cyborg technology where you can plug in a bit of extra memory into your brain, etc. And these are issues where we clearly need to have wide discussion and consensus, and my book is a small way to draw these issues to people's attention. But these are happening this century.
And you link this to space exploration, because your argument is that because of everything we've discussed, from growing population to growing resource use and carbon emissions and man-made climate change, there is an ever greater impetus for us as a species to explore beyond the frontiers of the planet and ultimately to find other places in this universe we can live. But your argument appears to be that we can only really contemplate doing that if we do leave behind our organic state.
Well, just to correct you a bit, I very strongly criticise people like Elon Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking for talking about mass emigration to Mars. I think that's a dangerous delusion. There's no way in our solar system which is as clement as the top of Everest or the Antarctic. So although I would cheer on crazy adventurers who want to go to Mars, I certainly don't think it's any solution, and it's a dangerous delusion to think that we can terraform Mars rather than dealing with climate change on the Earth.
But to put it bluntly, do you not believe that actually this melding of human intelligence with artificial intelligence gives us, in the longest of long terms, the capacity to imagine a post-human era where intelligent beings, whatever we call them, because there'll be certainly a modification of our organic humanness, these post-human beings will have the capacity to travel over unimaginable distances and perhaps colonize places and planets that we haven't even thought of.
Yes. Well, of course, the use of the word us is important. My scenario would be that humans stay on the Earth and don't change all that fast. But the post-human evolution will start with crazy pioneers who get to Mars by the end of the century, because they'll be away from the regulators who are going to be controlling these things on prudential and ethical grounds, and they will have every incentive because they'll be very ill adapted to Mars. And so I think the first post-humans are going to be created on Mars, and then, as you say, if they become electronic, they might be essentially immortal, and then of course they can go off to the blue yonder.
It's a fascinating set of thoughts. When you have these thoughts, is this you being playful, or do you want us to spend serious amounts of time furthering that thought process?
Well, I mean, I think some people just think about this, and actually I think there are only a few hundred people thinking about these far future scenarios and extreme risks in the world, and that's a good thing. But I think...
but you know what, it just strikes me, they're not really far future, because as you've just said, given the history of the planet, the tiny blink of an eye time lapse that human civilization represents on this planet, if we're talking about another 1,000 years until perhaps some of this could come into fruition, in terms of geological time or planetary time, that's absolutely nothing.
Oh, that's true, but of course the timescale of politicians and of individuals is far shorter. And I think in terms of where we put our resources, I carefully say that if I was an American, I wouldn't support NASA's manned program. I don't think
you wouldn't put any public money into a Mars program?
I put no public money into manned spaceflight, because robots can do all the practical things better than humans now. But I would cheer on the private companies like Elon Musk's company, because they can use private money and they can take higher risks than NASA could impose on taxpayer-funded civilians. So I would cheer on the private sector, but I would not spend any public money on this, because there are more urgent things to do on Earth.
So you actually think, because you've said that this may be so very important to the future of us as a species, and for us getting to a point where we're actually then contemplating, as you say, a post-human era, you're saying the market will sort of allow this to happen in the long run?
Well, it depends. You're using the word us. I think us on Earth.
No, I appreciate that, but in an ironic sense, you're saying it's the us on Earth who will be the catalyst for the them who you say might colonize other stars, other corners of our universe. None of that can happen without us.
Well, it can happen without any political decision supported by us.
Sure, that's what I'm interested in.
And they're separate. But I think, going back to the astronomical timescales, we've got as much time for evolution in the future as we've had up till now. Moreover, Darwinian evolution takes about 1 million years to evolve a new species, whereas technical evolution takes only a century. So this future evolution is going to be far faster and far less predictable. But of course, I certainly don't think we can imagine that we humans are in any sense the culmination, but we should, I think, regard our species and be sort of chauvinistic about our species and not want it to change too much.
We've talked in this interview about technologies, and we've also talked about ethics and values. What we haven't talked about is spirituality, but as you know, later in your studies and your life and your career, as you reflect on everything you've learned, do you find you have a space in your own thinking for a power beyond understanding, beyond rationality, beyond science?
Well, I mean, I share the sense of mystery and wonder with many people who are religious. I mean, I'm not religious in any dogmatic sense, but I do share that sense which they do have. And I also
So what is that sense then? It's not in a formal religion or a formal God, but what is it?
Well, it's a sense of looking at the universe and realizing it's something we'll never understand. Indeed, I have a chapter in my book when I discuss the limits of our understanding. We'll probably never understand in detail how our own brains work. So we're going to be limited in our understanding, but that doesn't mean we have to accept a particular dogma. Although when I do mention religion, I simply say it's an important creative force. The Neil MacGregor book is wonderful on that topic, incidentally, and it's something which is more important and more valuable to us now for its ritual.